The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape when Maria, singing bird, first saw the dust cloud approaching her village. She stood at the edge of the Apache settlement, her dark eyes scanning the horizon with growing unease. The rhythmic thunder of horse hooves grew louder, and she knew without counting that there were too many riders for this to be a peaceful visit. At 23, Maria had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her husband, Running Wolf, had been killed 6 months earlier in a skirmish with soldiers, leaving her to care for their 7-year-old daughter, Little Dove. The loss had carved deep lines of sorrow around her eyes, but it had also forged an inner strength that burned like an ember in her chest. "Mama, who are those men?" Little Dove asked, tugging at her mother's worn buckskin dress. The child's voice carried the innocence that Maria fought desperately to preserve in this harsh world. "I don't know, little one," Maria whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "But stay near me, no matter what happens." The riders crested the small hill overlooking their camp, and Maria's heart sank. These weren't soldiers in blue uniforms, but something potentially worse, a group of rough-looking men led by a figure she recognized from the stories whispered around evening fires. Buck Morrison was known throughout the territory as a man who took what he wanted when he wanted it. His reputation preceded him like the stench of death. Chief Gray Eagle emerged from his teepee, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the obvious threat approaching his people. At 72, he had negotiated with many white men, and he understood that survival sometimes meant making impossible choices. The Apache had already been forced from their traditional hunting grounds 3 times in the past decade. Their current location was barely suitable for sustaining life, with little game and poor water sources. "We mean no harm," Morrison called out as his horse came to a stop just outside the camp's perimeter. His voice carried the false friendliness that Maria had learned to distrust immediately. "We're just here to conduct some business with your chief." Maria noticed how Morrison's eyes swept across the camp, taking inventory like a merchant counting goods. When his gaze lingered on the women and children, she felt a chill run down her spine despite the desert heat. She had heard the stories of Apache women and children being sold to work in mines or worse fates in distant cities. Chief Gray Eagle stepped forward slowly, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "What business do you have here, Morrison?" "Well now, Chief, that's not very friendly," Morrison replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to help your people. Winter's coming, and from what I can see, you folks are running mighty low on supplies." It was true, and everyone in the camp knew it. The government supplies that had been promised were months overdue, and their last 3 hunting parties had returned nearly empty-handed. Children were already showing the early signs of malnutrition, their round faces beginning to hollow. "We have managed our own survival for many generations," Gray Eagle replied with dignity. "We will continue to do so." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that made several of the Apache children press closer to their mothers. "Chief, with all due respect, that's not what I'm seeing here. Those kids look hungry, and winter in these parts can be brutal. I'm offering to help." "What kind of help?" Gray Eagle asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be welcome. "I need workers at my ranch," Morrison said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "Hard workers. In exchange, I'll provide food, shelter, and protection for those who remain here." Maria felt her stomach turn. She had heard about Morrison's workers from other tribes. They were essentially slaves, treated worse than animals, with many never returning to their families. The word protection from his lips sounded more like a threat. "And if we refuse your generous offer?" Gray Eagle asked quietly. Morrison's false smile faded slightly. "Well, Chief, that would be unfortunate. You see, I happen to know that the Army's been looking for any excuse to move you folks again. Something about reports of raiding parties coming from this area. Of course, I could tell them that those reports were mistaken, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire." Maria understood the terrible position they were in. Morrison wasn't offering help. He was offering the illusion of choice while holding a gun to their heads. "How many workers do you need?" Gray Eagle asked, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership. "Oh, I'm not greedy," Morrison said, his false smile returning. "Just 5 or 6 of your strongest young people. Men and women both. I'm sure you can spare them." Maria's blood ran cold. She was young and strong, exactly the type Morrison would want. She glanced around the camp and saw the same realization dawning on other faces. Who would Gray Eagle choose to sacrifice for the survival of the rest? I need time to consider your offer, Gray Eagle said. Time's a luxury you don't have, Chief, Morrison replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. I need an answer now, or I'll have to ride to the fort and report those raiding parties I mentioned. The silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring. Maria could hear her heart beating in her ears as she waited for Gray Eagle's decision. She looked down at Little Dove, whose dark eyes reflected the confusion and fear that hung over the entire camp like a storm cloud. Very well, Gray Eagle said finally. Give me the names of those you want. Morrison's smile became genuinely pleased now. I knew you were a reasonable man, Chief. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket, consulting it as if he hadn't already made his selections long before arriving. I'll take young Tom, Standing Bear. He began, naming a man barely 18 who helped care for the horses. Sarah, Walking Moon. A woman in her 20s who was skilled at weaving and cooking. Joseph, Red Cloud. A strong man in his 30s whose wife had died the previous winter. Maria felt each name like a physical blow, knowing these people, knowing their families and their hopes and dreams. When Morrison paused and looked directly at her, she felt the world tilt slightly. And Maria, Singing Bird, he said, his eyes moving deliberately to Little Dove. I hear she's quite capable. No, Maria said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. Please, I have a daughter. She needs me. Morrison's expression hardened. Ma'am, I'm not in the habit of splitting up families. The child can come too. I'm sure we can find work for her at the ranch. The implications of his words hit Maria like a physical blow. Little Dove, barely 7 years old, forced into labor alongside her mother. The image made her feel sick. Take me instead, said a voice from behind her. Maria turned to see her brother, Eagle Feather, stepping forward. At 25, he was strong and capable, one of their best hunters despite the poor game in the area. Morrison considered this for a moment, then shook his head. No, I specifically need women for certain types of work. Maria will do just fine. Gray Eagle's face remained impassive, but Maria caught the slight tightening around his eyes. She understood that he was trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between the certain suffering of a few and the potential destruction of many. When do we leave? Maria asked quietly, accepting the inevitable. Right now, Morrison said. No point in dragging this out. Say your goodbyes quick-like. The next few minutes passed in a blur of tears and desperate embraces. Maria knelt down to hold Little Dove, tried to memorize every detail of her daughter's face. Will you come back, Mama? Little Dove whispered, her small hands clutching at Maria's dress. I promise I will find a way, Maria said, though she had no idea how she could keep such a promise. Be brave, little one. Stay with Uncle Eagle Feather, and remember that I love you more than all the stars in the sky. As she mounted one of Morrison's spare horses, Maria looked back at her daughter one last time. Little Dove stood beside Eagle Feather, tears streaming down her face, but trying to be brave as her mother had asked. The sight nearly broke Maria's resolve, but she forced herself to face forward. The 5 Apache captives rode in silence as Morrison led them away from the only home they had known. Maria's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but she was realistic about their chances. Morrison had 6 men with him, all armed, and they were heading into territory she didn't know. As they traveled, Morrison rode up beside her. You know, Maria, this doesn't have to be unpleasant for you. I treat my workers fairly, and there might be opportunities for advancement if you're smart about it. Maria stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge his words. She had heard enough stories about Morrison's fair treatment to know what he really meant. The strong, silent type, eh? Morrison chuckled. That's fine. You'll come around once you see how good life can be at the ranch. The sun climbed higher as they rode, and Maria began to get a sense of the vast distance they were covering. Each mile took her further from Little Dove and made the possibility of escape seem more remote. But she had survived the death of her husband, the loss of her traditional homeland, and countless other hardships. She would survive this too, and somehow she would find a way back to her daughter. As the day wore on, Morrison's men began to relax their vigilance slightly. They joked among themselves and passed around a bottle of whiskey, though Morrison himself remained alert and sober. Maria filed away every detail, every weakness she observed. If an opportunity for escape presented itself, she wanted to be ready. The landscape began to change as they traveled west. The sparse desert vegetation gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub, oak, and pine. Maria had never been this far from Apache territory, and, despite her circumstances, she couldn't help but notice the beauty of the unfamiliar terrain. They stopped once during the day to water the horses and eat some dried beef. Morrison made a point of sharing his food with the captives, another gesture that Maria recognized as calculated kindness designed to make them feel indebted to him. "See," he said as he handed her a piece of bread. "I told you I'd take care of my people." Maria accepted the food because she needed her strength, but she didn't thank him. She noticed that Sarah Walking Moon seemed to be falling for Morrison's act, nodding gratefully when he spoke kindly to her. Tom Standing Bear and the others maintained sullen silence, but Maria could see the hope beginning to form in Sarah's eyes. It made her want to warn the other woman, but she didn't dare speak openly. As evening approached, Maria caught her first glimpse of Morrison's ranch in the distance. It was larger than she had expected, with several buildings spread across a wide valley. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps Morrison's intentions weren't as sinister as she had feared. That hope died quickly when they rode into the ranch yard, and she saw the conditions of the other workers. The few Apache and Mexican laborers she glimpsed moved with the beaten-down posture of people who had lost all hope. They kept their eyes down as Morrison's party rode past, and none of them looked up to acknowledge the new arrivals. "Welcome to your new home," Morrison announced as they dismounted near a large wooden building that looked like a bunkhouse. "Maria, you'll be staying in the main house. The rest of you will be in here with the other workers." Maria's heart sank. Being separated from the others would make any escape attempt much more difficult, and Morrison's intentions in keeping her in the main house were becoming clearer by the moment. "I prefer to stay with the others," she said quietly. Morrison's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "That wasn't a request, Maria. You'll stay where I tell you to stay." As the sun set behind the mountains, Maria found herself standing alone in front of the imposing ranch house, clutching the small bundle that contained her few possessions. The other Apache captives had been led away to the bunkhouse, and she could hear Morrison giving orders to his men about guard duties and work assignments for the next day. The ranch house was larger than any building Maria had ever been inside. Electric lights glowed in the windows, and she could smell food cooking somewhere within. Under different circumstances, she might have been impressed by the obvious wealth and comfort. Now, it all felt like a prison decorated with fine furnishings. Morrison appeared beside her, having changed from his riding clothes into a clean shirt and vest. "Come on, let me show you around your new home." As they climbed the front steps, Maria caught a glimpse of movement in one of the upstairs windows. For just a moment, she thought she saw a man's silhouette, but when she looked again, the window was empty. Something about that brief glimpse stirred a memory, but she couldn't quite place it. "You'll have your own room," Morrison was saying as they entered a grand foyer lit by a crystal chandelier. "Meals will be provided, and you'll have access to the library if you can read." The casual mention of reading surprised Maria. Many white people assumed that Apache women were illiterate, but Maria had learned to read English from a missionary teacher who had briefly lived near their village years earlier. "What kind of work will I be doing?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Oh, various things," Morrison replied vaguely. "Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Mrs. Henderson, my housekeeper, will explain your duties tomorrow." The mention of another woman in the house gave Maria a small measure of relief. Perhaps Morrison's intentions weren't quite what she had feared. As if summoned by his words, an elderly woman appeared at the top of the staircase. She was thin and severe-looking, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her dress was plain but well-made, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had been running a household for many years. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Maria," Morrison called up to her. "She'll be helping out around the house." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes examined Maria from head to toe, taking in her Apache dress and the proud way she held herself despite her circumstances. "I see," Mrs. Henderson said in a crisp voice. "Well, she'll need proper clothes if she's going to work in the house. I won't have her wearing those heathen rags around decent folk." Maria felt her temper flare at the insult, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting angry now would only make her situation worse. Now, Mrs. Henderson, Morrison said with false joviality. Let's not start off on the wrong foot. Maria will adapt to our ways soon enough. Oomph, Mrs. Henderson replied, clearly unconvinced. We'll see about that. Come along, girl. I'll show you to your room. As Maria followed the older woman up the staircase, she caught Morrison watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was satisfaction there, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked almost like anticipation. The room Mrs. Henderson led her to was small but clean, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. It was more comfortable than any place Maria had slept in months, but it felt like a cage nonetheless. You'll be expected to be up at 5, Mrs. Henderson informed her. Breakfast is at 6, and your duties will be assigned then. I run a tight household, and I won't tolerate any nonsense. After Mrs. Henderson left, Maria sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. The mattress was softer than anything she was used to, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept returning to Little Dove, wondering if her daughter was safe, if she was crying herself to sleep, if she understood why her mother had been taken away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps new opportunities. Maria had survived this long by being observant, adaptable, and patient. She would need all of those qualities and more if she was going to find a way out of this situation and back to her daughter. The last thing she heard before finally drifting off to sleep was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her room, pausing briefly by her door before continuing on. In her exhausted state, she wasn't sure if she had imagined it or not, but the thought that someone might be watching her sent a chill through her tired body. As sleep finally claimed her, Maria's dreams were filled with images of Little Dove calling for her across an endless desert, her voice growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely into the vast silence of the night. The sound of a bell clanging harshly in the pre-dawn darkness jolted Maria from her restless sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for Little Dove before the reality of her situation crashed back over her like a cold wave. She was at Morrison's ranch, hundreds of miles from her daughter, and this was only the beginning of what might be a very long imprisonment. Maria dressed quickly in her buckskin clothes, knowing that Mrs. Henderson disapproved, but having nothing else to wear. As she made her way downstairs, she could hear the sounds of the household stirring to life. Somewhere in the kitchen, pots were clattering, and she could smell bacon cooking. The kitchen was a large, efficient space with a massive wood-burning stove and long wooden tables for food preparation. Mrs. Henderson stood at the stove, her gray hair already perfectly arranged despite the early hour. She looked up when Maria entered, her expression sour. "You're 3 minutes late," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. Punctuality is essential in this household. Maria didn't apologize. She had actually been quite prompt by most standards, but she sensed that Mrs. Henderson was the type of woman who used criticism as a tool to establish dominance. "Your first task is to help serve breakfast," Mrs. Henderson continued. "The men eat in the dining room at 6 sharp. You'll carry the platters, keep the coffee cups filled, and clear the dishes when they're finished." As Maria helped prepare the breakfast service, she took note of the kitchen's layout and the movements of the other staff. Besides Mrs. Henderson, there was a young Mexican woman named Carmen who worked as a maid, and an older Apache man named Joe who seemed to handle various odd jobs around the house. Both Carmen and Joe kept their eyes down and spoke only when necessary. When Maria carried the first platter of food into the dining room, she got her first good look at the men who lived and worked at the ranch. Morrison sat at the head of a long wooden table, looking well-rested and pleased with himself. 5 other men were seated around the table, all of them white, all of them wearing the weathered look of men who spent their days outdoors. But it was the man seated at the far end of the table who caught Maria's attention and held it. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and serious blue eyes. Unlike the other men, who were talking and joking loudly, he ate his breakfast in silence, occasionally glancing up at Maria with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Boys, this is Maria," Morrison announced as she set down the platter. "She'll be helping Mrs. Henderson around the house." The men's reactions varied. Some nodded politely. Others leered in ways that made Maria's skin crawl, and 1 or 2 seemed to deliberately ignore her presence entirely. But the dark-haired man at the end of the table simply continued eating, showing no reaction at all. "We can't afford to lose any more cattle to strays." The The dark-haired man looked up from his plate. "I'll handle the south fence," he said quietly. "No, Jake, I need you to work with the new laborers today. Break them in proper like," Morrison said with a grin that made Maria's stomach turn. Jake's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. "Whatever you say, Buck." So the quiet man's name was Jake, and apparently he had some authority over the workers. Maria filed this information away as she continued serving breakfast. She had learned long ago that understanding the dynamics between her captors could mean the difference between survival and disaster. After breakfast, Mrs. Henderson put Maria to work cleaning the upstairs rooms. As she dusted and swept, Maria paid careful attention to the layout of the house. She noted which doors were locked, which windows could potentially provide an escape route, and where the stairs creaked loudest. One room at the end of the upstairs hallway was locked, and when Maria tried the handle out of curiosity, Mrs. Henderson appeared behind her, as if from nowhere. "That room is off limits," the older woman said sharply. "Mr. Morrison's private study. You're never to go in there, do you understand?" Maria nodded, but her curiosity was piqued. Why would Morrison need a locked study? What was he hiding that required such secrecy? As she worked throughout the morning, Maria caught occasional glimpses of the ranch operations through the windows. She could see the Apache workers from her group being led to various tasks around the property. Tom Standing Bear was loading hay onto a wagon, while Sarah Walking Moon appeared to be working in a vegetable garden behind the house. They all looked tired and dejected, but at least they seemed to be unharmed. Around midday, Maria was cleaning the windows in the front parlor when she saw Jake walking across the yard toward the house. He moved with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable here, but there was something in his posture that seemed different from the other men. Less aggressive, perhaps. More thoughtful. He entered through the front door and headed toward what Maria assumed was Morrison's office. She could hear raised voices through the closed door, though she couldn't make out the specific words. The conversation lasted several minutes before Jake emerged, his face grim. As he passed through the parlor where Maria was working, their eyes met briefly. For just a moment, she thought she saw something like sympathy in his expression, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson sent Maria to take water to the workers in the fields. It was the first opportunity she'd had to speak with the other Apache captives since arriving at the ranch. "Are you all right?" Sarah Walking Moon asked in their native language, as Maria handed her a dipper of water. "I'm fine," Maria replied, also in Apache. "What about you? How are they treating you?" "Hard work, but no worse than we expected," Tom Standing Bear said quietly. "The white foreman is tough, but not cruel. It's Morrison we have to watch out for." "Have any of you seen a way to escape?" Maria asked, keeping her voice low. "They watch us closely during the day," Joseph Red Cloud answered. "At night, they lock us in the bunkhouse. There are guards, but maybe if we could find a way to get weapons." "No," Maria said firmly. "If we're caught trying to escape with weapons, they'll kill us for sure. We need to be smarter than that." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah asked. "I need more time to understand how this place works," Maria said. "Give me a few days to learn their routines, find their weaknesses. Then we can plan properly." As she walked back toward the house, Maria noticed Jake watching her from near the barn. When he saw her looking in his direction, he didn't look away as most of the other white men did. Instead, he approached her. "You speak English," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Maria replied cautiously. "Mrs. Henderson treating you fairly?" The question surprised Maria. None of the other men had shown any concern for her welfare. "Well enough," she answered, not sure why he was asking. Jake nodded, then seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "If you have any problems, any real problems, you can tell me." Before Maria could ask what he meant by that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the yard with more questions than answers. That evening, Maria was serving dinner when she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. "Got a telegram from Tucson today," Morrison was telling his men. "Seems there's a good market for Apache workers down south. Mining operations pay well for strong backs." Maria's hand trembled slightly as she poured wine into Morrison's glass. She understood now what his long-term plans were. The captives weren't just workers. They were commodities to be sold when it became profitable to do so. "What about the woman?" one of the men asked with a leer. "Maria's got different value," Morrison replied with a grin that made Maria feel sick. "Thought I might keep her around for a while." Jake's voice cut through the laughter that followed Morrison's comment. "She's got a child back at the village. The table fell silent, and Morrison's expression darkened. "How would you know that, Jake?" "I was there when you made the deal with the chief," Jake replied evenly. "The kid was clinging to her skirts when we rode out." "Well, that's too bad," Morrison said after a moment. "Apache kids are tough. She'll survive." Maria set down the wine bottle carefully, afraid that her shaking hands would drop it. The casual dismissal of Little Dove's welfare, the assumption that her daughter would simply survive without her mother, filled Maria with a rage so pure it took all her self-control not to attack Morrison with a carving knife from the table. Jake was watching her face, and she saw something change in his expression. He could see her pain, her anger, and for some reason, it seemed to affect him. After dinner, as Maria was cleaning up in the kitchen, Mrs. Henderson pulled her aside. "I don't know what you think you're doing, girl, but I see the way you look at Mr. Morrison. You'd better learn to hide those feelings if you want to survive here." "I don't know what you mean," Maria said carefully. "I mean the hatred in your eyes could burn down this whole house," Mrs. Henderson replied sharply. "Mr. Morrison's not a patient man, and he doesn't tolerate disrespect. Learn to keep your thoughts to yourself, or you'll end up like the last Apache woman who worked here." Maria's blood ran cold. What happened to her? Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing genuine fear. "Let's just say she couldn't learn to control her temper, and Mr. Morrison doesn't give second chances." That night, as Maria lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she tried to process everything she had learned. Morrison was planning to sell the Apache workers, possibly separating them forever from their families. He had specific and disturbing plans for her that went beyond simple household labor. And there had been another Apache woman here before her, one who had apparently met a bad end. But there was also Jake, who seemed different from the other men. His concern for her welfare could be genuine, or it could be another form of manipulation. Maria had learned the hard way not to trust white men easily, but something about Jake's manner suggested he might be an ally rather than an enemy. She was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside her door, and she held her breath, wondering if Morrison was coming to make his intentions clear. But after a few moments, the footsteps moved on. Unable to sleep, Maria got up and went to her window. The ranch yard was bathed in moonlight, and she could see a figure walking near the barn. Even at this distance, she recognized Jake's distinctive gait. He seemed to be checking on something, making rounds like a man who couldn't sleep. As she watched, he stopped and looked up toward the house. For a moment, she thought he might be looking at her window, but the distance and darkness made it impossible to be sure. After a few minutes, he disappeared into the barn. Maria returned to her bed, but sleep still wouldn't come. Her mind was racing with possibilities and plans, none of them very promising. Escape seemed nearly impossible given the isolation of the ranch and the number of armed men. Even if she could somehow get away, how would she find her way back to Apache territory? And what about the other captives? Could she really abandon them to save herself? The questions tumbled through her mind until exhaustion finally claimed her. Her last conscious thought was of Little Dove's face, and she silently promised her daughter that somehow, some way, she would find a path back home. The next morning brought new challenges and new revelations. Mrs. Henderson informed Maria that she would be taking over some of the cooking duties, as the previous cook had moved on rather suddenly. The implication was clear: people who didn't work out at Morrison's ranch tended to disappear. As Maria prepared breakfast, she found herself working alongside Carmen, the young Mexican woman who had been silent the previous day. When they were alone in the kitchen, Carmen spoke quietly in Spanish. "Be careful with El Patron," she said. "He has a temper, and he doesn't like women who think too much." "How long have you been here?" Maria asked in English, not wanting to risk being overheard speaking a foreign language. 2 years, Carmen replied, switching back to English as well. "My family needed money, and he promised good wages. The wages are good, but the cost is high." Before Maria could ask what she meant, Mrs. Henderson returned to the kitchen, and Carmen immediately busied herself with her duties. Breakfast proceeded much as it had the previous day, with the men discussing ranch business and Maria serving food while trying to remain invisible. But today she paid more attention to Jake, noting how he interacted with the other men. It became clear that while Jake had some authority on the ranch, his relationship with Morrison was complicated. He gave orders to some of the workers, but Morrison frequently overruled him or assigned him tasks that seemed designed to keep him busy rather than utilize his skills. After breakfast, Morrison approached Maria directly for the first time since her arrival. "Maria, I want to show you something," he said with the same false friendliness she remembered from the Apache camp. He led her outside to a small corral where several horses were penned. "You Apache are supposed to be good with horses, right? How about a mare here that's giving us trouble? Think you can gentle her?" Maria looked at the horse Morrison indicated. It was a beautiful bay mare with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing. But she could see the fear in the animal's posture, the way it shied away from the men near the fence. "She's been mistreated," Maria observed. "Previous owner didn't know what he was doing," Morrison agreed. "Thought maybe a woman's touch might work better." Maria understood that this was a test of some kind. Morrison wanted to see what she was capable of, but she wasn't sure whether succeeding or failing would be better for her situation. She entered the corral slowly, speaking softly to the mare in Apache. The horse's ears pricked forward at the unfamiliar language, and Maria could see curiosity beginning to replace fear. Working with horses had always come naturally to Maria. Her father had been known throughout their tribe for his skill with the animals, and he had taught her well. Within an hour, she had the mare eating grain from her hand and allowing Maria to touch her neck and shoulders. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said with genuine surprise. "Jake, you seeing this?" Maria looked up to find Jake leaning against the corral fence, watching her work. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. "Apache know horses," Jake said simply. "That they do," Morrison agreed, his wheels clearly turning. "Maria, I think you and are going to get along just fine." As Maria continued working with the mare, she became aware that word of her success had spread. Several of the ranch hands had gathered to watch, and even Mrs. Henderson had emerged from the house to observe. But it was Jake's attention that made her most uncomfortable. Unlike the others, who seemed to view her performance as entertainment, Jake watched with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Maria had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. When she finally left the corral, the mare was following her around like a large dog, completely calm and trusting. The transformation was remarkable, and Maria could see that Morrison was already planning how to use this skill to his advantage. "Reckon you could work with the other problem horses?" Morrison asked. "Perhaps," Maria replied carefully. She didn't want to seem too eager, but she also recognized that this skill might be her ticket to more freedom around the ranch. "Good, good," Morrison said, rubbing his hands together. "Jake, I want you to work with Maria on this. Show her which horses need attention." Jake nodded, though Maria thought she detected reluctance in his agreement. As the crowd dispersed and Maria returned to her household duties, she found herself with mixed feelings about what had just happened. On one hand, her success with the mare had clearly impressed Morrison and might lead to more opportunities to move around the ranch. On the other hand, it had also drawn more attention to her, and attention from men like Morrison was rarely a good thing. That afternoon, as she was hanging laundry behind the house, Jake approached her again. "You did well with the mare," he said without preamble. "Thank you," Maria replied cautiously. "Morrison's got more than a dozen horses that need work. Some of them are in pretty bad shape." Maria looked up from the clothesline. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, he said, "Because those horses deserve better, and because working with them will give you reasons to be outside the house." The implication was clear. He was offering her more freedom, more opportunities to observe the ranch, and perhaps plan an escape. But why would he do such a thing? "Why would you help me?" Maria asked directly. Jake's blue eyes met hers, and she saw something there that surprised her. It wasn't pity, exactly, but rather a kind of understanding that suggested he knew what it felt like to be trapped. "Let's just say I don't always agree with Morrison's methods," he said quietly. Before Maria could respond, Jake turned and walked away, leaving her standing among the drying clothes with her mind racing. Was Jake truly an ally, or was this some elaborate trap designed to test her loyalty? In her experience, white men who seemed helpful usually had their own agenda. But as she finished hanging the laundry and returned to the house, Maria found herself thinking about the look in Jake's eyes. There had been something genuine there, something that suggested he might indeed be different from Morrison and his other men. That evening, as she served dinner and listened to the men's conversation, Maria paid special attention to Jake's interactions with the others. She noticed that while the other men often made crude jokes or comments about the Apache workers, Jake remained silent during these exchanges. When Morrison gave orders about working the captives harder, Jake's jaw would tighten, though he never openly objected. It was becoming clear that Jake occupied an unusual position at the ranch. He had authority and Morrison's trust, but there were undercurrents of tension that suggested their relationship was more complicated than it appeared on the surface. As Maria cleaned up after dinner, she made a decision. Tomorrow, when Jake offered to show her the problem horses, she would accept. Not because she trusted him completely, but because any opportunity to gain more knowledge about the ranch and its operations was worth the risk. If Jake turned out to be genuine in his offer to help, she might have found an unexpected ally. If he was setting a trap, she would deal with that challenge when it came. But she couldn't afford to waste any opportunity that might eventually lead her back to Little Dove. That night, for the first time since her capture, Maria allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help her sleep more peacefully than she had since arriving at the ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Maria made her way toward the horse corral where Jake was waiting. She had spent the night considering her options, and despite her natural caution, she had decided to trust Jake enough to learn what he might teach her about the ranch's operations. Jake stood leaning against the fence rail, his hat pulled low against the bright morning light. When he saw her approaching, he straightened and gestured toward a group of horses in a separate pen. "These are the ones Morrison wants you to work with," he said, his voice carrying none of the false joviality that characterized Morrison's speech. Most of them came from a ranch that went bust last year. Previous owner used harsh methods. Maria studied the horses carefully. She could see the signs of poor treatment in their body language. Ears pinned back, heads held high in constant alertness, and the way they pressed against the far side of the pen when humans approached. These animals had learned to fear people, and with good reason. "How many men has Morrison lost trying to break these horses?" Maria asked. "3 men injured seriously enough to need a doctor," Jake replied. "One of them won't be riding again. Morrison was about to sell them to the glue factory when you showed up." The casual mention of such violence against the animals stirred Maria's anger, but she kept her expression neutral. "How much time do I have?" "Take as long as you need," Jake said. "Morrison's more interested in results than speed." As Maria approached the pen, she noticed Jake making no move to leave. "Aren't you supposed to be supervising me?" she asked. "I'm supervising you," Jake replied, settling onto a nearby fence rail. "But I'm also curious to see how you work." Maria felt a moment of self-consciousness under his gaze, but she quickly focused her attention on the horses. The lead mare, a gray with distinctive black markings, was clearly the most dominant animal in the group. If Maria could win her trust, the others would likely follow. She began by simply sitting near the pen, speaking softly in Apache and allowing the horses to grow accustomed to her presence. The gray mare approached the fence cautiously. Her nostrils flared as she tried to determine whether this human represented a threat. "What are you saying to them?" Jake asked after several minutes. "I'm telling them about the place where I come from," Maria replied. "About the mountains and the streams and the horses that run free there." "You think they understand?" Maria looked up at him, surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice. "They understand the tone, the intention. Animals know when someone means them harm, and they know when someone wants to help." "Is that how you knew I was different from the others?" Jake asked quietly. The question caught Maria off guard. She studied his face, trying to read his intentions. "Are you different from the others?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on something in the distance. "I used to think so," he said finally. "Now I'm not so sure." Before Maria could ask what he meant, the gray mare nickered softly and stretched her nose toward Maria's outstretched hand. The breakthrough she had been working toward had arrived, and she focused all her attention on building that fragile connection. Over the next hour, Maria gradually worked closer to the horses, using techniques her father had taught her combined with instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. Jake watched in silence, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just observing her methods. "Your father taught you this," Jake said when Maria paused to rest. "How did you know that?" "The way you move, the patience you show. That kind of skill usually comes from family." Maria felt a pang of grief at the mention of her father, who had died 5 years earlier in a skirmish with soldiers. He said that horses were like people in many ways. They remember kindness, but they never forget cruelty. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Maria looked directly at Jake. He also taught me to be careful about trusting people who seem kind but might have hidden motives. Jake's expression grew serious. That's good advice, especially in a place like this. What kind of place is this exactly? Maria asked, sensing an opening to learn more about the ranch's operations. Jake glanced around, checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. On the surface, it's a cattle ranch. Morrison runs about 2,000 head on 40,000 acres. But that's not where the real money comes from. What do you mean? Morrison has contracts with several mining operations and railroad construction crews. They pay premium prices for workers who can handle hard labor in difficult conditions. Maria felt her stomach turn as she realized the implications. Workers like us. Like you, Jake confirmed grimly. Apache, Mexicans, Chinese, anyone who doesn't have family or friend with influence who might come looking for them. And you're part of this operation? Jake's jaw tightened. I manage the legitimate ranch operations. The other business, that's Morrison's domain. But you know about it. Knowing and participating are different things. Maria could hear the defensiveness in his voice, but she also detected something else. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. Whatever Jake's exact role in Morrison's operation, it was clearly something that troubled his conscience. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you deserve to know what you're up against. And because Jake paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Because I've seen too many good people disappear from this place, and I'm tired of pretending it's not happening. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Morrison rode into the yard accompanied by two of his men, and Jake immediately stood up from his position on the fence rail. How's our horse Whisperer doing? Morrison called out as he dismounted. She's made good progress, Jake replied. The gray mare is already responding to her. Morrison approached the pen and whistled low when he saw the gray mare standing calmly near Maria. I'll be damned. Jake, how long would it have taken one of the men to get this far? Assuming no serious injuries, probably 6 weeks. Maybe longer. And she's done it in 2 hours, Morrison said with satisfaction. Maria, I think you and I need to discuss expanding your responsibilities. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Morrison's pleased expression suggested that her success had just made her more valuable to him, which was not necessarily a good thing. Mr. Morrison, Jake interjected, she'll need time to work with each horse individually. This isn't something that can be rushed. Of course, Morrison agreed. But there's no reason she can't handle other duties while she's working with the horses. Maria, starting tomorrow, you'll be responsible for all the livestock on the ranch. Horses, cattle, even the chickens. The assignment was clearly intended to keep Maria busy and isolated from the other Apache workers. It would also give Morrison more opportunities to observe her and potentially make his intentions toward her more explicit. Understand, Maria said carefully. Excellent. Jake, I want to show her the entire operation. Every corral, every pasture, every animal on this ranch. I want her to know this place inside and out. After Morrison and his men rode away, Jake turned to Maria with an expression of concern. You realize what just happened, don't you? He's isolating me from the others and giving me access to the entire ranch, Maria replied. The question is whether that's good or bad for my situation. Both, Jake said grimly. On one hand, you'll have more freedom to move around and learn the layout of the property. On the other hand, you'll be more visible to Morrison and his men. What about the other Apache workers? Have you seen them today? They're working the south fence line. Hard labor, but they're unharmed as far as I can tell. Maria felt some relief at this news. As long as the others were safe, she could focus on gathering information and looking for opportunities. Jake, she said carefully, if someone were to try to escape from this ranch, what would be the biggest obstacles? Jake studied her face for a long moment before answering. Distance, terrain, and tracking. We're 60 miles from the nearest town, and most of that is desert. Morrison has men who are skilled at following tracks, and he's got agreements with local law enforcement. What kind of agreements? The kind where escaped workers are returned as stolen property rather than freed as human beings. The bleakness of her situation was becoming clearer, but Maria refused to give in to despair. There had to be a way out. She just needed to be smart enough to find it. As they spent the rest of the morning touring the ranch, Jake proved to be an invaluable source of information. He showed her not just the livestock areas, but also the guard posts, the supply storage buildings, and the routes used by the ranch hands during their daily routines. The supply wagon comes every 2 weeks, Jake explained as they examined the ranch's main storage building. Usually arrives on Wednesday, stays overnight, and leaves Thursday morning. How many guards does Morrison usually post at night? 2 men walking patrols, plus whoever's on duty in the bunkhouse watching the workers. Maria filed away this information along with everything else Jake had shared. A plan was beginning to form in her mind, though it would require careful timing and considerable risk. They were returning to the house for lunch when Maria noticed a commotion near the workers' bunkhouse. Several of Morrison's men were gathered around someone on the ground, and she could hear angry voices. "What's happening?" she asked Jake. Jake's expression darkened as they got closer, and he could see the situation more clearly. Trouble. One of the Apache workers, Joseph Red Cloud, was lying on the ground while 2 of Morrison's men stood over him. Joseph's face was bloodied, and he was clearly struggling to get up. He tried to run. One of Morrison's men was explaining to the foreman. "Found him about a mile south of here, heading for the hills." Maria felt her heart sink. Joseph was one of the older men in their group, with a wife and 3 children back at the Apache settlement. The desperation that would drive him to attempt an escape on foot across 60 miles of desert was heartbreaking. "Bring him to the house," Jake ordered. "Morrison will want to deal with this personally." As Morrison's men hauled Joseph to his feet, Maria caught his eye briefly. She saw defeat there, and shame, but also a flicker of determination that suggested his spirit wasn't completely broken. "This isn't good," Jake said quietly as they watched the procession head toward the main house. "What will Morrison do to him?" Jake's silence was answer enough. That afternoon, Maria was forced to continue her household duties while Joseph's fate was decided in Morrison's locked study. She could hear raised voices through the door, but couldn't make out specific words. When the conversation finally ended, Morrison emerged with a grim expression. "Get the others," he ordered one of his men. "I want all the Apache workers in the yard. Time for an object lesson." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized what Morrison intended. She had heard of such lessons from other tribes who had dealt with ruthless white men. They were designed to terrify the remaining workers into complete submission. Within minutes, all the Apache workers were assembled in the ranch yard under heavy guard. Tom standing bare, and Sarah Walking Moon looked frightened but defiant. The 2 men who had been working the fence line appeared exhausted and confused. Morrison emerged from the house, flanked by several armed men. Joseph Red Cloud was brought out behind them, his hands bound, and his face showing the effects of the beating he had received. "I want you all to pay attention," Morrison announced in a loud voice. "This man tried to steal from me. He tried to take my property without permission." Maria understood that Morrison was referring to Joseph himself as the property that had been stolen, but the other workers might not immediately grasp the twisted logic. "In this territory, we have laws about theft," Morrison continued, "and we have traditional punishments for thieves." Jake stepped forward from where he had been standing with the other ranch hands. "Buck, maybe we should discuss this privately." Morrison's eyes flashed with anger. "The time for discussion is over, Jake. I've been too lenient with these people, and this is the result. You gave your word to Chief Gray Eagle that they would be treated fairly," Jake pressed. "And they have been treated fairly. But fairness doesn't mean there are no consequences for breaking the rules." Morrison gestured to 2 of his men, who brought forward a wooden post that had been driven into the ground near the corral. Maria realized with horror what Morrison intended. 20 lashes, Morrison announced. "And if anyone else tries to run, the punishment will be worse." "No," Maria said, the word escaping her lips before she could stop herself. Morrison turned toward her, his expression dangerous. "What did you say?" "I said no," Maria repeated, stepping forward. "If you need to punish someone, punish me. I'm the one who should have stopped him from trying to escape." "Maria, don't," Jake said urgently. But Maria had made her decision. She couldn't stand by and watch Joseph suffer for the crime of wanting to see his family again. Joseph has a wife and children. They need him to return home safely. Morrison's false smile appeared, more chilling than his anger had been. How touching. The Apache woman wants to protect her friend. "She's right about one thing," Jake interjected. "Joseph's more valuable to you healthy than injured." Morrison considered this for a moment, his calculating mind weighing options. You make a good point, Jake. A damaged worker is a less profitable worker. Maria felt a moment of hope that Jake's intervention might save Joseph from the whipping. So here's what we'll do, Morrison continued. No whipping for Joseph. Instead, he'll spend the next 3 days in a root cellar with no food and only water. A little hunger might help him appreciate the meals he's been getting. The root cellar was little more than a hole in the ground used for storing vegetables. 3 days in that cramped, dark space would be torture, but it was better than 20 lashes. And as for you, Maria, Morrison said, turning his attention back to her, since you're so eager to take responsibility, you can join me for dinner tonight. We need to discuss your expanding role here at the ranch. The invitation sent ice through Maria's veins. A private dinner with Morrison was exactly what she had been dreading since her arrival. That's not necessary, Jake said quickly. She's got plenty of work to keep her busy. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he looked back and forth between Jake and Maria. Jake, you seem mighty concerned about this Apache woman. Is there something I should know about? I'm concerned about efficiency, Jake replied evenly. She's more valuable working with the horses than sitting at dinner tables. The horses will still be there tomorrow, Morrison said with finality. Maria, 8 o'clock. Wear something appropriate. As the crowd dispersed and Joseph was led away to the root cellar, Maria found herself standing alone in the yard with Jake. You shouldn't have interfered, Jake said, but his tone suggested admiration rather than criticism. I couldn't let them hurt him for wanting to go home to his family. And now Morrison has an excuse to get you alone. Do you understand what that means? Maria understood perfectly, but she also knew that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Morrison decided to bring her to the ranch. At least now, it would happen on her terms, when she was expecting it. I need a weapon, she said quietly. Jake looked around to make sure they weren't being observed. There's a knife in the kitchen. Small paring knife, but sharp. Where will you be tonight at 8? Why? Because if Morrison tries to force himself on me, I'm going to fight back. And when I do, I'll need someone I trust to help me get the others and escape. Jake stared at her for a long moment. You're talking about killing Morrison. I'm talking about defending myself. What happens after that depends on him. Maria, if you kill Morrison, his men will hunt you down and hang you from the nearest tree. There won't be a trial. There won't be any mercy. Then we'd better make sure we all get away clean. Jake ran his hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was proposing. You're asking me to betray everything I've worked for here. I'm asking you to help me save innocent people from slavery. It's not that simple. Yes, it is, Maria said firmly. Either you're the kind of man who stands up for what's right, or you're not. Everything else is just excuses. Jake didn't respond, but Maria could see the conflict in his eyes. Whatever hold Morrison had over him, it was strong enough to make him hesitate even when faced with clear moral choices. That afternoon, as Maria went through the motions of her regular duties, her mind was focused entirely on the evening ahead. She had no illusions about Morrison's intentions, and she knew that her refusal to cooperate would likely mean death for herself and possibly the other Apache workers. But she also knew that submission would be a different kind of death, one that would destroy her soul even if her body survived. She thought of Little Dove, waiting for her mother to return, and she knew that she had to remain someone worthy of her daughter's love and respect. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Maria made her final preparations. She located the knife Jake had mentioned, slipping it into the folds of her dress, where it would be easily accessible. She also took note of which guards would be on duty and where the other Apache workers would be housed for the night. Mrs. Henderson provided her with a dress that was supposed to be more appropriate for dinner with Morrison. It was blue cotton, simple but clean, and it fit well enough despite having been made for someone else. As Maria looked at herself in the mirror, she realized that the dress made her look younger, more vulnerable. Perhaps that was intentional. At precisely 8 o'clock, Maria knocked on the door to Morrison's dining room. Her heart was beating fast, but her hand was steady as she prepared to face whatever the evening might bring. Come in, Maria, Morrison called from inside. I've been looking forward to our conversation. As Maria opened the door and stepped inside, she caught a glimpse of Jake through a window, standing near the barn and looking toward the house with an expression of deep concern. Whether he would ultimately help her or not remained to be seen, but at least she knew that someone was aware of her danger. The dining room had been set for two, with candles and wine creating an atmosphere that Morrison clearly hoped would be romantic. Maria felt sick at the charade, but she forced herself to remain calm as she took the seat Morrison indicated. "You look lovely," Morrison said, pouring wine into her glass. "That dress suits you much better than those Apache rags." "Thank you," Maria replied, not trusting herself to say more. "I want to talk to you about your future here," Morrison continued. "You've proven yourself to be quite valuable, and I think there are opportunities for advancement if you're smart about things." "What kind of opportunities?" Morrison's smile grew predatory. "Well, that depends on how cooperative you're willing to be." As the evening progressed, and Morrison's intentions became increasingly clear, Maria's hand moved closer to the knife hidden in her dress. The moment of truth was approaching, and she silently prepared herself for whatever would come next. The candlelight flickered across Morrison's face as he leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. She sat across from him, maintaining perfect composure despite the growing tension in the room. The dinner had been a carefully orchestrated seduction attempt, with Morrison alternating between false charm and subtle threats. "You know, Maria," Morrison said, refilling his wine glass for the third time, "most women in your position would be grateful for the opportunity I'm offering you." "What opportunity is that?" Maria asked, though she dreaded the answer. "To move from the servants' quarters to more comfortable accommodations. To have fine clothes, good food, and protection from the harder aspects of ranch life." Morrison's smile was predatory. "All it requires is a certain level of cooperation." Maria felt the weight of the hidden knife against her leg. "And what would happen to the other Apache workers?" "That's not your concern anymore. Your concern should be your own future. They're my people. Their welfare is always my concern." Morrison's expression darkened slightly. "Your people, as you call them, are my property now. Their future depends on their usefulness to me." The casual reference to human beings as property filled Maria with rage, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And what about their families back at the settlement? What about them?" Morrison shrugged. "That's ancient history now." Maria thought of Little Dove, probably crying herself to sleep every night, wondering when her mother would come home. The image strengthened her resolve. "I have a daughter," she said quietly. "I know. Jake mentioned her." Morrison waved dismissively. "Apache children are resilient. She'll survive. You don't understand. I made her a promise that I would come home to her." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that made Maria's skin crawl. "Maria, you need to accept reality. You're not going home. This is your home now, and the sooner you accept that, the better things will be for you. And if I refuse to accept it?" Morrison's false friendliness evaporated completely. "Then you'll find that life can become very difficult very quickly. I've been generous with you so far, but my patience has limits." As if summoned by his words, the door to the dining room opened, and two of Morrison's men entered. Maria recognized them as his most brutal enforcers, the ones who had beaten Joseph Red Cloud earlier that day. "Everything all right in here, boss?" one of them asked. "Just fine, boys," Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. "Maria and I are just having a friendly discussion about her future." The implicit threat was clear. If Maria didn't cooperate willingly, Morrison was prepared to use force. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in more private surroundings," Morrison suggested, rising from his chair. This was the moment Maria had been preparing for. As Morrison moved around the table toward her, she stood slowly, her hand moving toward the concealed knife. "Actually, I think our conversation is finished," she said clearly. Morrison stopped, his expression shifting to one of anger. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, Maria. I understand perfectly. You want to make me your slave in every way possible. But I am not property to be owned, and I am not a woman who submits to threats." "You stupid Apache bitch," Morrison snarled, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you? What I can do to your friends?" Maria's hand found the knife handle. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you?" The tension in the room was thick as the two men near the door began to move closer. Morrison raised his hand to stop them, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "You're going to threaten me in my own house?" Morrison asked with amusement. "With what?" "Your bare hands." "If necessary." Morrison laughed again. "I've got to admire your spirit, even if it's misplaced. Tell you what, I'll give you one more chance to be reasonable." "My answer is the same." "Then, You've made your choice, Morrison said, nodding to his men. As the two enforcers moved toward her, Maria pulled the knife from its hiding place and held it in front of her. The blade was small, but sharp, and she held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Well, Morrison said with genuine surprise. Our little Apache princess has claws. Stay back, Maria warned the approaching men. Boys, take the knife away from her. Try not to damage her too badly. She's still useful. The first man reached for Maria's wrist, clearly expecting to disarm her easily. He wasn't prepared for the speed and precision with which she moved. The knife flashed across his forearm, opening a deep cut that sent him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. The second man was more cautious, circling around to approach from her side. Maria kept the knife moving, maintaining distance between herself and her attackers. Enough of this, Morrison snapped, pulling a pistol from his belt. Drop the knife, Maria, or I'll shoot you where you stand. Maria looked at the gun, then back at Morrison's face. She could see that he was serious, but she also saw something else. He was angry at being defied, but he still wanted her alive. The gun was another bluff, albeit a more dangerous one. If you shoot me, you lose what you want, she said steadily. There are other Apache women. You're not irreplaceable. But I am the one who can gentle your horses. I am the one who saved you from losing valuable livestock. Would you throw that away just to satisfy your ego? Morrison's jaw tightened, and Maria could see him weighing his options. The wounded man was still bleeding, and the other was maintaining his distance, clearly reluctant to face her knife again. The standoff was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. The dining room door opened, and Jake stepped inside, taking in the scene with a quick glance. What's going on here? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Nothing that concerns you, Jake, Morrison replied without taking his eyes off Maria. Just a misunderstanding that's about to be resolved. Jake looked at the wounded man, the drawn gun, and Maria holding the knife. Looks like more than a misunderstanding. Maria is having trouble accepting the terms of her employment, Morrison said. I'm helping her understand the situation better. Jake stepped further into the room, positioning himself between Morrison and Maria. Maybe we should all take a step back and think about this. I said it doesn't concern you, Morrison snarled, turning the gun toward Jake. The movement gave Maria the opening she had been waiting for. While Morrison was distracted, she lunged forward, knocking the gun from his hand. The weapon clattered across the floor as Morrison stumbled backward. Now, Maria shouted to Jake, hoping that he would finally choose a side. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Jake hesitated. Then, he dove for the fallen pistol, coming up with it pointed at Morrison's men. Nobody move, Jake ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. Morrison stared at Jake in shock and fury. Have you lost your mind? These are Apache savages. These are human beings, Jake replied firmly. And what you were planning to do to her is wrong. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Jake, Morrison warned. Maybe, but it's my choice to make. Maria lowered her knife, but didn't put it away. Can you get the others out? Jake nodded toward the window. There's a guard change in 20 minutes. If we time it right, we can get to the bunkhouse and free your people. What about Joseph? Maria asked, thinking of the man still locked in the root cellar. We get him too. Morrison laughed bitterly. You fools have no idea what you're doing. Even if you get off this ranch alive, where are you going to go? It's 60 miles to the nearest town, and every lawman in the territory knows to return escaped Apache workers to their rightful owners. We'll figure that out when we get there, Jake said. And you, Jake? You really think you can throw away everything you've built here for a bunch of Indians? Jake's expression hardened. I never built anything here, Morrison. I just helped you steal from people who couldn't fight back. You self-righteous fool. You've been taking my money for 3 years. That makes you just as guilty as I am. You're right, Jake admitted, which is why I'm going to try to make it right. Maria felt a surge of respect for Jake. Whatever his past mistakes, he was finally choosing to do the right thing, even though it would cost him dearly. We need to move, she said urgently. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Jake nodded and gestured toward the wounded man, who was still clutching his bleeding arm. Can you walk? The man nodded sullenly. Good. You're going to help us get to the bunkhouse quietly, or you're going to spend the night tied up in here? Your choice. I ain't helping you, the man snarled. Then you're staying here, Jake said, pulling rope from a supply closet. Within minutes, Both of Morrison's men were securely bound and gagged. Morrison himself they left conscious, but tied to his chair. "Think about this, Jake," Morrison said as they prepared to leave. "You can still change your mind. Send the woman back to her people. And we'll say this whole thing was a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was me thinking I could work for you without becoming like you," Jake replied. As they left the dining room, Maria felt a mixture of relief and terror. They had committed themselves to a course of action that would either lead to freedom or death, with very little middle ground. The ranch yard was quiet as they made their way toward the workers' bunkhouse. The guard change Jake had mentioned was happening on schedule, creating a brief window of opportunity. "There," Jake whispered, pointing to a guard walking toward the main gate. "He'll be gone for 10 minutes. They slipped through the shadows until they reached the bunkhouse. The door was locked, but Jake had keys as the ranch foreman. Inside, they found Tom standing bare, Sarah walking moon, and the two other Apache men sleeping on rough bunks. They woke instantly when Maria whispered their names in Apache. "We're leaving," she said quietly in their native language. "Jake is helping us escape." Tom standing bare looked skeptical. "The white foreman? Why would he help us?" "It's complicated," Maria replied. "But I believe we can trust him." "Where is Joseph?" Sarah asked. "Still in the root cellar. We'll get him next." As the Apache workers gathered their few possessions, Jake kept watch outside. The root cellar was located behind the main house, which would require them to cross open ground where they could be easily spotted. "There's another way," Jake said when Maria explained the problem. "Underground passage from the house to the cellar. Used to be a wine storage tunnel." They made their way back toward the house, moving carefully through the shadows. The tunnel entrance was concealed behind a false wall in the basement, and Jake led them through a cramped passage that emerged near the root cellar. Joseph Red Cloud was barely conscious when they found him. 3 days without food had weakened him severely, but he was coherent enough to understand what was happening. "Can you travel?" Maria asked him in Apache. "I can travel," Joseph replied weakly, but with determination. Getting 6 people plus Jake off the ranch without being detected would be nearly impossible on foot. They needed horses, weapons, and supplies if they were going to survive 60 miles of desert travel.